New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
Free my mind, open my heart with the whispers of truth. To live a conscious life, to live a conscious life on the growing edge. On the growing edge.
And now, here's Allie.
Hello and welcome to Growing Edge Live. I'm Allie Benjamin, and it is my great joy to be here today. Each week we come on and have a conversation with a soul-centered individual that channels their time, their talent, their energy, their resources, their love, their creativity into doing good work in the world. And so I'm so glad that you're here to join in this conversation today. I know that my guest and his story and the work he does in the world will deeply touch you, your heart, and inspire you to take some of what he's presenting today and take that out into the world. So my guest today is David Alexander, Reverend David Alexander. He is a visionary leader, an author, a social justice advocate. He's a lifelong student of metaphysics and spiritual living, a pastor, a father, and a social activist. Now, I don't usually do this because I like to just dive into getting to know my guest right away, but I'm going to read a little bit of your bio because really it underscores your passion for the work that you do in the world. And in reading and following you over the last few months, I've seen how passionate you are and how dedicated you are to the work you do. And so I wanted to honor that, what I've experienced in watching you and actually meeting you in person a few months ago. So David was raised in New Thought, had a profound spiritual awakening at age 13, after which he dedicated his life to helping others. In 2004, David co-founded the New Thought Center for Spiritual Living and served as its senior minister for 15 years. Reverend David currently serves as spiritual director for the Spiritual Living Center in Atlanta. Dr. David is the author of Freedom from Discord, The Promise of New Thought, Liberation Theology, and the visionary organizer for the groundbreaking workbook, Recovery from the Lie of Whiteness, a 12-step approach. He's recently launched a new Substack where he shares articles, podcasts, interviews, and more. And it's a space where he discusses all manner of spirituality, personal development, politics, and justice work. He has so many more accomplishments and accolades, and so we will post those in the show notes. So, David, welcome to Growing Edge Live.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allie. Great to see you. Great to be here. Hello, everybody.
Yeah, we met a few months ago, October, at Unity Village, where we were both attending, and you were speaking at the ANTN, the Affiliated New Thought Network annual retreat. And that's where I have first seen you in person, but for years have been reading articles in Science of Mind magazine and hearing about you, and I think we've crossed paths a few times in meetings and groups. So it was really a pleasure to see you and other folk from CSL. And I forgot to mention, for those of you that are listening, you can't see it, but for those of you who are watching, you can see Liberation Lens, This is a new podcast that David has on Substack. So, welcome. And where do we start? Let's start at the beginning, because what piqued my interest was this spiritual awakening at age 13. And you and I were discussing that I too had an experience when I was young. So that instantly grabbed my attention, and I want to know a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was, it's kind of born and raised, I say, in the New Thought tradition. My mother had found, excuse me, the science of mind or religious science teaching through a coworker of hers when she was in her 20s, working in Phoenix, Arizona, and a coworker gave her a copy of Science of Mind magazine, and she liked the readings in it and the daily readings, and eventually asked that coworker, who became a lifelong friend, hey, tell me, what is this church? My mom really did not want anything to do with religion. She had grown up Catholic and Protestant, split family in that regard in the Midwest, in Illinois and Wisconsin, and had moved, kind of as far away from home as she could think of when she was in her 20s to Phoenix, Arizona, and sort of was a hippie and a renegade and all of that. And but this coworker reached out to her and said, you might like the stuff that's in this. And my mom did, and eventually was interested in trying it out. And so that's how I got to be raised in the church, was the fact that somebody had reached out to her and brought her along. So by the time I came along, that was part of her spiritual practice, was attending the Valley of the Sun Church of Religious Science in Phoenix, Arizona, with Dr. Bob Henderson. And so I grew up in that environment, in the youth groups, and there was for a while there that I didn't go because I didn't like the particular teacher or whatever, the volunteer in the Sunday school, but I still wanted to be at church. I still wanted to be there. And so I was the one, I would wake up on Sunday morning, I would knock on my mom's door, and I would tell her, it's going to take us 30 minutes to get there. We got to go. And so she'd be like, oh, what am I going to do? She really wanted to sleep in, I'm sure. And we got to drive, 30, 45 minutes in the Phoenix heat in the summer, or the car with no air conditioning, yada, yada, all the stuff. And we would go, and I would sit with her in the sanctuary, and would sit through the service. And my favorite part was the meditation. And I would hold my mom's hand, and sometimes she would have these, or I would put a crystal, because she had these crystals in her house, and because, like I said, she was a hippie. And so I'd take one of the crystals out, like an amethyst or a white crystal, out of her purse, and either put it in my hand or put it in her hand, and then we'd hold hands. So we'd hold the crystal together during the meditation portion of the service. And then after church, on the way home, we'd talk about what we felt. Mm-hmm. And we'd talk about the vibration and all of that, the frequency. And so I just grew up in that environment, and of course loved the positive affirmation of what I heard and what I was exposed to message wise. And then eventually, matriculated into the youth groups, back into the high school and middle school groups, and so on. And at about 13, our world was kind of shifting. My mom had the opportunity to move to Albuquerque, and my older brother was heavily involved with drugs, and in and out of mental hospitals, and just really having a difficult time. And my mom was a single mom. She's raising these two boys, and we were struggling in Phoenix. And so Sunday school and church was kind of an oasis in the midst of that chaos. And I began to struggle because I saw my life and my trajectory as like I was going to go to the same school he went to, coming out of grade school. And I saw the way his life unfolded, and I didn't want that for myself. And so I was really, struggling. And so, yet I knew these principles. And so I just kind of sat down and I said, okay, God, power, universe, intelligence, whatever you want to be called, here's the deal. I ain't doing that. I ain't doing that. And it looks like it's the only path,
Mm.
So show me something else, or take me out. I don't want to be here. And within a very short amount of time, I think it was literally just weeks of that kind of prayer and kind of, spiritual, I don't even know what to call it. I guess, clashing moment of really just getting like, prove to me, kind of shaking my fists at the universe, like, prove me these principles, everything changed. My mom got an offer in Albuquerque, and we sold the house, and within weeks we were gone, and life changed forever.
Mm.
And we started going to the church in Albuquerque, and I was at a youth retreat, and I was sitting and meditating on this hillside, I think like in somewhere in Colorado, like Fort Collins or something, this beautiful cabin that we were at. And Spirit said, "Remember the deal?" And I went, "Oh yeah." "Remember that prayer you prayed? Look, where are you now? What's happening?" And I was like, everything is different. None of these kids know me, right? I have to tell my story of who am I, where'd you come from, all of that. And it dawned on me that whatever I said was whatever I wanted to say.
Mm.
They didn't have to know anything that, I didn't want them to know, or I didn't have to carry any baggage or story of who I thought I was, or who I was being forced to be, or, whatever that was at that time. Like, there was a blank slate, and there was an opportunity for me to just create something new. And I was sitting with the kind of the profound nature of that. And Spirit said, "Remember that deal we made? This is what you wanted, blank slate. You can, what are you going to do?" And I just went, "Oh, wow." Okay. I got it. And I was very grateful, deeply thankful, and, moved to tears. And I kept returning to that place of meditation about that, and having that conversation over the next couple of years. And it was like, what can I do? I get it. And I'm, making myself available to be the best me I can be, and to be helpful to people, and all of that. And how can I, what can I do? And the answer came back over and over and over again. Anything less than your full self back into this gift that you've been given is inadequate.
Mm.
And so it was like, well, what do you want from me? And it was like, everything.
Mm.
Give me everything. I've given you everything. Why wouldn't you give me everything? Give me everything. What have you got to lose? And it was then that I realized that, I went to high school and college, and I did stand-up comedy, I did social work, I did a number of different things. But everything that I did, I realized, even if I'm successful at this, it won't be adequate to repaying the debt, and I didn't mean debt in a negative way, but repaying and being in balance and in integrity with what has been given to me through this alignment with this higher power. Nothing less than everything.
Mm.
And so that was the kind of continuous dawning of that awakening that was like, dedicate your whole life to this, because this is your whole life. And so that's, the decision to go into practitioner studies and then ministerial school and all of the other things came out of that place. And I keep returning to that. That's why writing monthly for Science of Mind magazine is such a joy for me, because it's the place from which my mother discovered the teaching. And so I could literally get to give back, into the very publication. And then, of course, be a minister and serve this movement for 20 years now as a pulpit minister is really a phenomenal gift.
Mm. I really get the sense that you have continued that calling, that mantra, give me everything.
Mm-hmm.
That is something that is so obvious, reading about you, listening to you speak on Sundays and other times, that you are answering that call or staying fully centered in that awareness and that consciousness.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that the gifts that you bring with all of that have deeply impacted so many. And you truly are a thought leader in the New Thought movement and within Science of Mind or Centers for Spiritual Living, especially. So thank you for your commitment at such a young age to your own personal discovery and development, and to be able to stand in leadership and to be such an inspiration. That's a blessing.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a continued evolution. Like, again, there's never an edge to it. It's always just like, give me more. What else can I surrender? How else can I unfold into this and this expanded awareness of the allness of God and the principles, to get really practical about it, the principles of consciousness and how what we create out of our consciousness and therefore the power and the responsibility we have, in the work that I do in justice work, privilege is something that's talked about a lot. And sometimes, white identified people get really squirmy around that conversation about privilege. But it's really understanding the power that you have, whether, whether you asked for it or not, whether you quote unquote deserve it or not, in power over dynamics. But the question isn't whether you have it or not. The question is, what are you going to do with it? So it's not a question of privilege as much as it is a question of leverage. What leverage do you have? And it's the same thing in our spiritual awakening. It's like, now that you know this, right? You have an awareness about the levers of the universe and how we create reality. And so what are you going to do with that awareness?
Yeah, I remember Oprah saying a long time ago, once you know better, you do better.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's, something that's always sticking with me. The name of this podcast, Growing Edge, is all about that. We're always right on the growing edge of our own becoming.
Yeah.
And we do, I feel, have a responsibility to make this world the best that we can with what we've got.
Yeah.
And there is a great responsibility that we all carry, but so many are asleep to that, or maybe a bit lazy to that. And so I'm glad that, we've been in this New Thought movement for decades. And I look out at the world and, New Thought's gone mainstream. There's tons of books, shows like Oprah I mentioned, was a kind of a way show back when, to sort of bring spirituality and New Thought principles into the public domain, to make them seem like something we can all do. It's just natural. And so, yeah. So you mentioned your mother a lot. And were there other people in your childhood or in your adolescence that deeply impacted you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I sometimes I feel bad when I tell that story, because I talk about not wanting to go to the youth group at a particular time. I don't even remember what section or age group that was, but no shade on youth group volunteers and children's church leaders, because the truth is that then later, when I did go back, the teen group leaders over the years were hugely impactful in my life. And that was one of the first places where I wanted to get back, was I became a junior leader in those systems, and then eventually a leader of youth groups, both our group in Albuquerque. When I was in college, I became the teen group leader. I became a camp leader, and so those spaces were hugely significant for me. And those individuals who, the vast majority of them not making a dime, volunteering their time to be with adolescents and young people at a time, and to be a significant relationship and adult in their lives, to be that sense of safety, that sense of trust, and the person that you can have that tough conversation with and get honest feedback from, and all of those things, and learn from and look up to, and all of that. So all of those individuals were huge. They were just, my pillars, and still have relationships with many of them. And so those individuals. And then when I started reading, studying and reading more, of course, Ernest Holmes, and, then reading who he read, and Emerson, and all of that. And then I began to branch out, because one of the things that my youth group leaders, insisted upon was this idea of the universality of our teaching, that Holmes kind of distilled and brought something, into modern language, but it had tentacles and all these other things. And so being a curious mind, and, an intellectual, I guess, a budding intellectual at that time, but, my mind is still that way. It's like, I want to know where the sources are, who, this person read it from so-and-so. Well, what did they read? And, trace it back and find those places. And so I began to branch out and read more and more, including outside of the kind of the traditional stream. We know the lineage of New Thought. So that was, of course, the first step. But then even outside of that, because one of the things that was impressed upon me was this idea of universality. So it wasn't just the stream. It wasn't just that Holmes studied with Emma, and Emma, studied with Mary, and Mary met with Quimby, and so on and so forth. All of those things were fascinating to me. But then it was like, well, where else is somebody kind of discovering the same idea, but doesn't know that there's a movement called New Thought, right? Mm-hmm. Or it hasn't been developed yet, or whatever the case may be. So you have, E.W. Kenyon in the Christian world, who influenced Kenneth Hagin, which influenced the whole Word of Faith movement, which is the hands-on healing, which, is very different theologically in a lot of ways. But they both studied with Quimby. Right. So there's roots that go back, and so then you have people like Bishop Carlton Pearson, and Bishop Yvette Flunder, and others in today's world who have awakened to kind of these broader New Thought ideas and concepts, and many, many others, and it's like, well, where'd they get it from? Because they're not reading, at least initially, they weren't reading Ernest Holmes, but they were reading something that influenced them. And so I started exploring some of those things. Some of the people you see in the wall behind me, of course, Dr. King and James Cone, reading The Cross and the Lynching Tree, and talking about oppression in America, and white supremacy and Christianity, and the concept, from James Cone, we get the whole concept that, God is black, essentially, and that God is with the oppressed, and that anything less than that is a form of oppression itself. And he's pushing back against kind of white Christian theologians that kind of dominate the narrative. Just blew my mind open. And so I've always been encouraged by teachers and mentors over the years to read something from, and I teach students this to this day, read something from somebody else's eyes that are not your own, right? And assume that what you're reading is true. Mm-hmm. So if you're male, read female authors, right? If you're white, read black authors. If you're, whatever you are, like, read from somebody else's worldview. And because we're often fed just like kind of the white male dominant narrative in history and whatnot. And so it's like, read from a different lens, and then assume that what you're reading is true. Because if we're all one, right? And so those spaces and places began to really open my eyes and began to expand my thoughts quite a lot.
Wow. So when you were starting to read, trying to make links to other religions and other groups, was this when you were still in Portland? Was this part of your inspiration to move to Atlanta?
Yeah, well before that, even when I was still in college in Albuquerque, I was reading a lot, and I remember I'd somehow came across a book I still have over on my bookshelf over here, called "Stealing Jesus," and it's by Richard Bauer, I think. And the tagline of it is "How Fundamentalism Betrays Christianity." And in it references, and I remember getting this book at a library, and again, thank God, talk to people around you. If you're the checkout person, if you're the librarian, the teacher, the mentor, I've had people just say things to me. I only met this person once checking out this book, and they said, "Oh, if you like this, you'd really like Bishop John Shelby Spong." And I was about 17 years old.
Mm.
And I said, "Who? A bishop? What?" And they said, "Yeah, there's, right in the same section you were at, you should check that out. If you like this, you'll really like that." Okay. And so I checked out, and I got, I don't remember the first Spong book that I got, but, and that turned into something that, here's just quick fun story on that. I started reading Spong, of course, prolific author, reading everything that he was doing at that time. And then fast forward, I'm ministering in Oregon. We created the church. We're doing our thing. And Bishop Spong gets a honorary doctorate award from our organization, United Church of Religious Science, I think at that time. And my youth group leader got an award as well at the same annual convention. And so we sent her, they're sitting at the same dinner table together. And Spong is, learning who's at the table. And he says, "Tell me about you." And she says, "Oh, I'm the youth group leader. I'm getting the youth champion award," or whatever, at the dinner tonight. And he says, "Oh, that's great. What community are you at?" And she says, "Oh, New Thought Center in Oregon with David Alexander." He pauses and he says, "Reverend David Alexander?" She says, "Yes." And she says, and John Shelby Spong says, "I know him. I listen to his sermons." So she comes home and tells me this story, and I'm like, "What?"
What?
Yeah. So the way that conversation ends is he says, "Yeah, I listen to his sermons. I get them in the mail." And so one of my practitioners at the center is his niece. And so every time I would quote Spong, which was often, she would send him the CD saying, "Hey, Uncle Jack, I think you might like this." And he would listen to it. And so then we started corresponding. And of course, years later, we met up, and I was able to have coffee and a meal with him on a couple of different occasions. But that all came from that librarian who was like, "Hey, you like this book? You might check out this guy."
I love it when things like that happen.
Yeah,
when those sort of divine connections, those paths cross with that just make it feel like, okay, there's something magical here happening. There's something, I'm on my right path, or I am involved in manifesting my reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so meeting someone that you've looked up to, read, studied, for so long.
It was such a great moment in my life. And so I've always been convinced that there is, right, this, as Ernest Holmes would call it, this golden thread that's running through all things. And so there are people out there who are, discovering this, but they don't know who we are. They don't know this podcast, but they might discover it today, because somebody will say, "Hey, check this out." And so bringing those pieces together, connecting, has always been kind of my forte and passion, to make those connections and build those bridges. And so I've done a lot of strategic alliance work over the years, but it really has been just the nature of who I am. In that bridge building, because I want to sit in a room where people are coming from different paths but discovering the same truth. That's the most beautiful room to be in, You know, like you come from a completely different walk. You know, you grew up Pentecostal and you're talking about consciousness. Cool. You know, and you only have studied metaphysics, and you know, you think Christianity is, over with or whatever, okay, cool, and you come from science and quantum physics and whatever, right? Like, let's all get at the same table and have a conversation. What would emerge out of that conversation? And what that to me is true, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Because then we discover that, we have more in common than we don't. We come from different paths, and we think that our path informs our thinking, and so we're obviously passionate about it. But the truth is, we probably have more in common with other people who have very different paths than us, than we think, because we're after something that's bigger than our path. Our path is pushing us towards it, for sure. But what it is that we're after is beyond the trappings of our own path.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
We're going to take a very short break, and we'll come back and talk about this some more. So we'll see you in a minute.
Please help us say thank you to our organizational sponsors, including the Hefferland Foundation, Affiliated New Thought Network, International New Thought Alliance, Science of Mind Archives and Library Foundation, Center for Spiritual Living Denver, Center for Spiritual Living Midtown, New Thought Philadelphia, Planned Happiness Institute, Summit Center for Spiritual Living, One Heart Retreats, Center for Spiritual Living on the Lake, Unity Kitchener, Unity Spiritual Center Ottawa, Om Center for Spiritual Living, Satya Center, Begin Within Ministries, Center for Spiritual Living North Jersey, Unity of Savannah, and the Center for Spiritual Living Seattle, as well as all of our individual donors. Thank you for being part of the New Thought Media Network. Please like, share, and subscribe. New Thought Media Network, positively inspiring.
Free my mind, open my heart with the whispers of truth. To live a conscious life, to live a conscious life on the growing edge. On the growing edge.
And now, here's Allie.
And we're back with my guest, David Alexander. And we are talking about all kinds of things, how his life led him to where he is as a minister, as a social activist, author, and all the things that you do. And one thing you said, that learning that we all have things in common, and being at events like you described with, when sitting at tables with people from different faith traditions or different walks of life. And by the way, that my show is based on having people come from all different walks of life and making connections in this way. And we do all have so much in common. And when we can sort of push aside or part the curtain of all the particular differences in, our ideologies and our beliefs, at the core, humans, we want the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in our current world environment, our atmosphere that we're living in, it seems like there is so much division, and there is all these different sides and different voices speaking out. And it's hard to really come together and connect with those common values and qualities that we all align with. And I think that's my goal, is to find those. How can we connect with these things that we can all stand for, all work towards, all build our lives around, that will ripple out into making like CSL says, a world that works for all. And so I'm wondering, I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. Like, what do we stand for? And one of my minister friends, she's just mentioned that she's going to DC on the 5th and going to march and all of that. And so that's got me thinking, I'm going to see what's going on at our Capitol. And I marched a few years ago with my pink pussy hat on for the Women's March. And so but I know that on my board of directors, we've got individuals that you could put into sides, if you will, but there's different voices, different allegiances, different opinions. And so I'm always trying to find, what do I stand for? Not what I'm protesting against. And maybe that's a bit of a safe, a safe strategy. So I'm not, I'm trying to not rock the boat or keep the peace, but it is important for me, and I'm sure countless others, to march, to stand up when we feel like things aren't being presented the way our vision has it. And so can you talk a little bit about being an activist, standing for something, but not othering, and not falling into that trap of being angry about other people having their own points of view and opinions?
Yeah. Wow. And 30 seconds, go. There's a lot to unpack there. Well, a couple of things. One, I think that, anger can be very holy and very constructive. Doesn't have to always be destructive. It obviously can have a destructive element, but even fire births new life, right? Even fire can be the heat that is required for new seeds, for reforestation to occur. So sometimes the fire, as James Baldwin would say, is appropriate next time the fire. So I think we keep that in mind, because that's one thing in New Thought, is we have a tendency to really play nice and want to keep it in the play nice playground, where nobody gets offended and nobody gets hurt, and that if somebody is offended or hurt, that we make that the wrong thing. That, well, it must be wrong because somebody was offended and hurt, and we're all one. So at a very practical level, as a minister, I often say I might talk about things that upset your political disposition. But just like we say, so pause on that for just a moment, right? And put that aside. The way in which we teach these principles doesn't change. Principle is principle. And what we have said is that both the science of mind and New Thought in general is a lens or a way of thinking about how consciousness works, and that it could be applied to anything. And we've said at the individual level, it can be applied to your finances, it can be applied to health or relationship or whatever your heart desires, whatever it is you're working on to manifest, whatever your growing edge is, right? We know that. So why are we carving out an exception for politics or the things that we think are political or whatever it is? The principles work the same. And the way that works is a couple of different things. One, we remember that we are not our thoughts. We have thoughts, but we're not our thoughts. So if I'm teaching you about prosperity, and I'm teaching you about the abundance of the universe, and that your consciousness is reflecting perhaps something about your beliefs about worthiness or inadequacy, and maybe some thoughts that you have about that. And if you get offended, which is very likely, by the way, right? Because money is a touchy subject, right? But if you get offended by that, the teacher doesn't stop and say, oh, well, gee, I offended you. I guess I should never teach about abundance again because it's offensive, and it might disturb your current state of thinking. No, actually, just the opposite. What we do is we say, I'm going to keep teaching. If you're offended by the principle, one, you might want to look at that, right? That's the indication that there's some work to do, that you examine, right, that area of offense. Why am I offended? Where does that come from? What is that? Is that hurt? Is that shame? Is that guilt? What is the offense? And what is the source from which that comes, right? So we're taught to go in and to examine those things with a critical eye, critical, not defensive, right? But critical and reflective and a sensitivity and all of that. And that to the degree that we can do that, either by ourselves or with some help with a practitioner or minister or other guidebook or meditation or what have you, that we will be successful and we will discover things and we will grow and then able to better be a place of embodiment of the greater truth of who and what we are. So far, everything I've said is pure metaphysics, right?
Yes.
And so why is that process any different, for, again, these subjects of our collective humanity, when we're talking about civil rights or, the rights of our trans brothers and siblings, rights of our LGBTQAI plus family, rights of women in healthcare, rights to earn a living wage, rights to education, all the different things that are quote unquote being politicized. They're not political in nature, they're human in nature, but they're being politicized by one side or the other, right? So what I seek to do in my work is to apply the same methodology of our spiritual practice, which is to say, if I say something, and I'm talking about, I'll give an example, when I was in Oregon, I was very involved in the fight for marriage equality, and I was the chair at the time of an organization called the Community of Welcoming Congregations, which was a community of different faith communities that believed in LGBTQ equality and integration into the spiritual life of all of those different traditions. And so one of the things we said about that fight or that quest that we were on, because we don't, in New Thought, we don't like the word fight either, is that love is love, right? And love is a principle. And that there is no such thing as quote unquote gay marriage. There's just marriage. There's just the desire to spend your life with someone and in a committed relationship. And that if you are sick, that person can come into the hospital room, and that person can have access to, certain things and your Social Security if you die or whatever. And being in those relationships, and that desire is universal and human and natural, regardless of who the two parties that it bubbles up with, right? And then I would speak out about that and say, so therefore we need to, to vote on this or to work on this or to sign petitions or whatever the case may be. And people would say, you're being political. No, I'm talking about love, right? Mm-hmm. But love is being politicized. Mm-hmm. There's a difference.
Yeah.
Right. And so again, if my talking about a principle of love offends your political disposition, then take it up with your political disposition, not with me. Right? Mm-hmm. Because it's the same thing, again, if we're in an abundance class or in a relationship class and I say something and it triggers you, then take it up with your trigger, not with the teacher. That's your job as a practicing metaphysician, is to examine the nature of that offense and say, well, what is that? Where is that? Why, when the minister says something and it pokes at the way I voted, or the way I've been brought up to believe politically, or the way I identify in a political sense, why does it offend that? That's a very good question. We shouldn't avoid that question. It's not my job to give you the answer to that question. But if I provoke that question in you, then you should take it up on yourself to examine what that is about. And maybe discover that, just like we say, you're not your thoughts, right? Maybe you're not your political ideology either. Right? Maybe that's just a temporary mask that you're wearing. Maybe there's value to why you wear it. And maybe there's value to the identities that we have. I'm a father, but the spiritual part of me is not, right? That who I am is beyond that. If I get so attached to that identity, or a husband, or this or that, we have identities that we wear as like clothing, but ultimately we're not any of those things, right? They're just positions and roles that we play for a temporary period of time, and they bring value to us, but they also might be blocking us in some way. If we're so attached to them. I ran cross country and played basketball when I was younger, but I can tell you today that this body does not do those things. But if I was right, my wife will be like, let's go, for a jog or whatever. I say, I'm a former I'm retired, right? But if I was so attached to that identity, it would be painful, right? It would be problematic. Because it was an identity that I had then, not one that I have now. So I just invite us to have a curiosity about what we get offended about and why, and to really treat it with an open hand and treat it with self-love and compassion. Like, nobody's trying to shame you. Nobody's trying to blame you. But if this pokes at you, then maybe take a breath, breathe into that, and ask yourself why, and don't shoot the messenger. Don't attack the minister or the teacher to say, well, they shouldn't be doing that from the pulpit. If that's what they feel called to do, why not? Because the other part of it is, and I know we're talking long about this, but because the other part of it is this whole idea that spirituality or religion shouldn't be political, that it should be neutral, and our spiritual communities should be kind of these neutral spaces. It pops up in our conversations with each other as a movement all the time, and listservs in different places. That is a very new idea in the world of religion, right? Religion for centuries, forever, in every tradition around the world has always been a place where there's a voice for the oppressed and the downtrodden, to lift up, to push back against empire and power in political forms, whatever forms they are, and to make room for more humanity, not less, more compassion, not less. Religion or spiritual spaces have always been a space for that. It's not until recent modern day Western white Protestant Christianity that we suddenly say, oh no, we got to be neutral and not get involved in that. That is a leftover of slaveholder religion, when we whitewashed Christianity, gave it to slaves, and said, be meek and mild like Jesus, right? And it was a complete kind of bastardization of the teaching, which ultimately the Black church didn't accept. They went, wait a second, what about this Moses part? What about this guy who liberates the captives? We're kind of like this, this is cool. So it never has really taken, except it kind of in white Protestant spaces. And we go, oh no, we can't be political in church. Where did we get that idea?
Well, I live in Utah, and we have a big movement of Latter-day Saints,
right?
That is a patriarchy, and I mean, I'm taking a little sidestep from your theme. That does not has taken that message of meek and mild and placed it on women, and so we've got opportunities with this current political environment A lot of different things are being brought up to be examined, to be considered for each of us, whatever. And for me, I've got 3 granddaughters. I've got a daughter, 3 granddaughters. And so my focus is to, look at those issues and expand out to, the issues that you're speaking of, and so many around the world that we're not even aware of in this country, because we all do have these personalities, these identities based on where we live, based on, our upbringing. My husband and I, when we're discussing this, we kind of always get to the conclusion that basically humanity is having an identity crisis. And that's the root cause of this whole thing. Yeah. But to actually wake up on the 5th of April and, get dressed and drive on down to the Capitol, there is some soul searching to do. Because when you said, it's, if you've got an opposition to something, you got to turn it around and examine your own beliefs about that disturbance or that thing that you're. And so I'm quite happy to stay there. I'll just turn it within and stay in my meditation cushion and examine my own consciousness and remove the barriers to reveal love's presence. But I can't. I've always, ever since I was a child, had this growing up in England, my father was conservative. And for whatever reason, at a young age, I really, probably because he didn't, I assigned with the Labour Party. It just seemed more fair. And so I've always had this notion that things need to be fair. And being an only child, I didn't have brothers or sisters to, compare myself. I thought I was equal to any human and could do a job doing this or that. So I never sort of felt like I was limited in my sex. And so I want, if you could share something as to why it's okay for spiritual folk to stand up and speak up, as you've mentioned that religion has been political for hundreds of years. And what can we do to break the habit of sitting on our hands, of leaning into our whiteness or our, delusions about, the hierarchy of things? What can you say to help us get a bit more active and feel a bit more inspired to stand up for what we value?
Well, it kind of goes back to where the show began, right? Where our conversation began, which is in the process of awakening, which for me, my justice work came out of my meditation work. It came out of sitting with, in my book, I call it the radical implications of our teaching. What is the radical implication? If you take the idea of oneness, and I used to do this, I sit in meditation and say, take the idea of oneness and stretch it as far as it can go. Where does that take you? What is the radical implication of, this notion? And so that's why, my work is based around this idea of belonging and the liberation lens and liberation theology. And so what comes out of that is, what good does it, here's the question I would ask, what good does it do you to know that you're one with everything, A, B, that you have a power within you that you can create a life of your dreams, or a life that spirit desires for you? What good does it do to meditate on those two things on a daily basis while your neighbors down the street are suffering, and your neighbor, you're nearby, whoever that is, whether it's people who vote differently than you, people who, whatever, we've talked about lots of different versions of that. What good does it do? And what does that say about your awareness or even your embodiment of the idea of oneness that says you have access to this universal power that can liberate you, but others are suffering?
Mm-hmm.
It falls kind of short.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. It's okay to be on our own journey of emancipation, our own journey of learning about our power and creating the life. That's human development. That's the evolution of our soul from child to adulthood. So there's nothing wrong with any of that. You got to learn how to use your voice and how to direct your consciousness and how to all of that. But at some point, right, your constant contemplation of what is it that gives you the power to do that is the same power that's connected to everybody and everything. And so what about those who are, do we just say, well, they have to get their consciousness together, right? Maybe that's what we think initially, but then you begin to learn how systems are created and that people are often suffering from systemic issues. And one of the things I talk about in my book is about the idea that things that are created from suffering that is systemic deserves more than just an individual answer, right? The source is systemic. Poverty is a systemic issue, meaning there are systems and power and structures that keep it in place. We haven't had a raise in the minimum wage in this country in I don't know how many years now, but it's just stuck at $7 or something. You cannot make a living. That's a systemic problem. Has nothing to do with anybody's individual consciousness. They did not create that. Especially, I've got a 20-year-old son. He did not come into this world. His consciousness did not create the fact that politicians for decades now have not raised the minimum wage, right? He didn't create that. That's a system that he walked into. So I can't blame his consciousness for not being able to, make more money than minimum wage or whatever, the case may be. So things that have systemic roots deserve systemic solutions, right? We have to, because it's the nature of what it is. It is a systemic problem. So therefore it has to have a systemic solution. To take something that is a systemic problem and only emphasize individual solutions, meaning it's your problem, you got to do something about that. That is the epitome of gaslighting.
Mm-hmm.
So to get back to your question, what do? Well, we contemplate the nature of our oneness, and that means that my liberation is tied into your liberation. My ability to create the life that I want is tied, so we say, well, what do you want as an individual? I want freedom. I want to be able to do whatever it is that I want, wake up in the morning and just go live the life of my dreams. Okay, well, great. Let's play Magic Genie for a minute. Let me grant you that wish. Now you can do that. You better hope that the bus driver shows up today, and that the airline pilot shows up today, and that the garbage people have done their job the night before, and that like all of these things have to be in place in order for you to quote unquote live the life of your dreams, right? And so you get there and you get to the island of paradise, and you better hope the hotel workers and the cook staff and the cleaning, like all those people are in place. And by the way, they're trudging along just trying to pay their bills today, while you order another drink and sit on the beach and live the life of your dreams. So it's about awakening to the idea that we are tied into a inextricable network of mutuality, as Dr. King would tell us, right? And therefore our own spiritual practice has to do more than just liberate ourselves. It has to begin to serve the liberation of the planet.
Okay, we're right at the top of the hour. Yeah, it's true. And you gave us a lot to think about and some really good reasons why it's so important that we speak up and speak out and consider everyone in our decisions to maybe march on the 5th. Who knows?
Yeah.
David, thank you so much for sharing. People can get in touch with you at your website and find you on Substack, David Alexander. There's RevDavidAlexander.com. And my daughter's name's Alexandra, by the way, so I always get tongue-tied in saying right. Alexander. So we know where to find you, and thank you again. And I'll see you along the way. And for everyone here today, thank you for being here. I know that you've been spiritually nourished and fed and hopefully motivated by what you've heard today from my beloved guest, David. So see you next week. Peace and blessings. Mwah. Bye-bye.
Free my mind, open my heart with the whispers of truth. To live a conscious life, to live a conscious life on the growing edge.